questions, as I say, drop them into the chat. So Samantha, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. So most of you know me. For those of you who don't, I'm Samantha Martin Mcauliffe, a lecturer here in the School of Architecture at UCD. And a few years ago, we were given the opportunity to visit northern Kenya, specifically Samburu, and we were invited by the local county government to essentially build or co-create a collaboration between architects and other disciplines from the university and the Samburu tribe, looking at the intersections of architecture, but also gender, climate change, migration, and race. And the idea was to take some of these fairly abstract terms that are constantly filtering and coming to the foreground in education that tend to be kind of siloed, particularly with regards to climate change. And we wanted to look at the idea of sustainability from as many avenues and facets as possible. So it was a really transformative experience. And what what I've done today is to gather a group of students who kind of show the multi generational, if you will, aspect of the project. It's served to feed into new projects. And at the end, we can talk a little bit, if there's time, about the next phase of this pilot, which would have happened already had it not been for the pandemic. So it's been moved to next year. So we have Sylvia Doherty and Samu Bakri, who were part of the original group that came with us on the pilot project to Kenya. And then we have a whole number of students who participated in seminars in the master's degree, the MArch program at UCD last year, and they're all going to speak to you about their role in learning how to curate architecture from the global south, or at least put a new perspective and challenge some of the prevailing paradigms for how we exhibit architecture from outside of the Western tradition. And they're going to use specifically the exhibition, which is currently installed in the Irish Architectural Archive, to talk you through that experience. And then a few of these students as well are carrying on some of the work that they did last year to work on dissertations that relate or overlap or extend the work that they did within the seminars. And then it's really nice to see we actually have some new students in the fourth year seminars this year who are involved in this podcast. So, and they're in the nomadic pastoralist seminar that I'm teaching. So that's really great. We're already seeing this sort of building on a body of work. So that's all I'm going to say. I'm going to hand over to Andre Govitz, who is also is going to sort of help structure the discussion. Andre is doing his dissertation on curating architecture of the Global South, so he's well positioned to kind of give an overview of what's in store.
So yeah, that's perfect. Thank you, Samantha. So yeah, as Samantha was saying there, Samburu Stories Exhibiting Architecture in the Climate Emergency effectively recounts the collaborative experience of building the Nkaji, which is the vernacular house of the Samburu lowlands in Kenya. And it derived from the direct response to the climate emergency, which I think we can all agree is one of the most significant problems humanity currently faces. And the exhibition is structured in that we analyze climate change, we analyze gender, we analyze migration, and house building itself. And we'll talk about that throughout the next hour as well. But I just want to say first as well that the exhibition is actually quite significant in the fact that it's the first of its kind in Ireland, in that it's the first exhibition in Ireland that's on architecture, not only from Kenya, but actually from Africa as well. And while focusing on the architectural approaches of a local community in the Global South, we've also foregrounded a collaborative learning environment, and the exhibition serves as a vehicle for reappraising how we curate vernacular non-Western architecture. And from this, it aims to kind of, I suppose, inspire and educate a wider audience on what we can actually learn about climate change once we actually expand our horizons. And I suppose we can all agree that there is a profound duty of us to seek outwards for better practice, because currently, responses to climate emergency aren't being made fast enough on a national front, and we need exhibitions such as Samburu Stories to seek innovation during such a crisis. The next slide that's there actually shows the exhibition, which is in the Irish Architectural Archive in Marion Square, off of Marion Square. And we installed this exhibition during the first week of September, and it was officially live on the 16th of September, and it's destined to end on the 18th of December. However, I suppose because of COVID, it's kind of not very live right now. However, we are expecting to have an online version of it hopefully towards the end of the year. And that's kind of on my foot, but yeah, we'll get into that later, I suppose. The next slide there that we have is just a little short clip of a film that we worked on in our first semester of fourth year, this time last year actually, and it was a collection of footage that Sylvia and Samu and the others who went over to Samburu had taken, and we compiled it into this film. So this is just the first 2 minutes, and Samu actually speaks in this.
In July 2019, academics and students from across the College of Engineering and Architecture, as well as academics from the university more widely, undertook a pioneering overseas project in Samburu, a region in north-central Kenya. This transdisciplinary project responded to a number of sustainable development goals and pressing global challenges, in particular, climate change. The key underlying question in this initiative was, what can a traditional Kenyan house teach us about climate change? Situated in a conservancy area of the Samburu, we developed an on-site learning lab documenting and recording the entire process of planning and constructing a traditional Samburu dwelling, with the intention to understand the architecture, environment, and culture of African pastoralists.
Oops, great, yeah. So I think Samu is going to take over from now to talk about some of the work that he's completed.
Thanks, Andre. So I used a drone for the first time as a survey tool and to create some film in Samburu of our case study in Serata. And the resulting outputs were aerial photographs showing environmental conditions, allowing for time analysis, identifying material properties to help us communicate architecture and settlement patterns. This method of work allowed us to start to understand the thinking process behind the layout of the Manyata, a Samburu homestead pertaining to rituals, spirituality, gender, and the semi-nomadic pastoralist society of Samburu. On the last day of our house building project, we're also joined by Irene Senai, who is the Samburu County Minister for Culture, Gender, and Youth Affairs. So I was also showing her the process of using a drone to capture Samburu, and this is the first time a drone was used in the area in this way. Next slide, please, Sylvia. Yeah, so in this meticulous NKG construction drawn analysis by Owen, alongside the traditional woven grass roofing mat, which has been replaced by plastic sheets over the last 20 years, and images of some of the local flora used to build NKG, shows the importance of the connection between what is built and where the building materials originate from. This layering building process is part of a material knowledge acquired through generations of experience, whose application and spiritual significance is universally understood within their society. In the West, the building envelope has become a highly engineered commodity whose layering has become so complex that an intuitive understanding of its material properties and their origins is now impossible. This step in architecture is now largely out of sight or out of mind for architects and poses major questions in the academy that scholars are beginning to reassess. And next slide, please, Lily. So 2 pictures for me that described the trip best were these photos taken by Alice Pansy. The photo on the left is of Jane in her NKG, where we carried out our project. The heart is a deep spiritual connection within the home, and with the use of cloth and plastic sheets as roofing protection, ventilation is an immediate issue for the traditional Samburu home. The smoke would have previously been subdued by traditional woven grass roofing mat, but is also used to preserve meat, fat, bone, blood, and milk stored in their calabashes and tin cups. The smoke also deters insects from destroying the timber frame. We also tested an experimental NKG in Heidi's camp to look at ways of how the women can cook without releasing large amounts of smoke. On the right is Thousand, a Samburu elder who led the construction project, and as you can see by expression, the whole process was celebration. The Samburu women are intuitive designers resilient to the adverse effects of the climate crisis. Next slide, please. In my current thesis, based in Inishmore, I am working on how architecture can be a force to empower self-sufficient islanders. I continue to adopt the use of the drone as a survey tool to collate cultural heritage conservation documentation of Dunangus, showcasing one of the earliest expressions of Irish Indigenous architecture. But the karst landscape remains susceptible to marine erosion. The image on the left showing a labyrinth of the unique dry stone walls of Inishmore shows a connection to Samburu in a contrasting landscape. In a way, the traditional thinking process of the islanders like Samburu women intuitively using a layered approach in order to create these field boundary walls without the use of any mortar.
I'm going to give a bit of an explanation of mapping as a resource that was available to us to describe the people that lived there before we went on the trip. And then this will give a bit of a historical context as to why this area of Africa was mapped and demonstrated a biased imperialistic reality, which was somewhat part of my dissertation last year. And then I'll describe a bit about how this led to an experimental map that Akriti, Peter, and myself created. And then they'll describe their dissertation this year after the process of the exhibition and map making. So on the first slide, it shows the start of how Africa was communicated back to Europe through the use of maps. So it shows here a time known as the Scramble for Africa, which was a period of time when European countries started to map and divide out the continent among themselves to extract natural resources and feed their wealthy industrial economy. So on the map on the left, you can see different countries colored in different colors. So in pink, you can see where the British Empire controlled this larger area along the northeast of the continent, which had the entire Nile River in it, all the way back to its source in Lake Victoria. And the British explorers were incentivized early on in 1858 to find the source of the Nile, which they found at Lake Nyanza, which was later named Lake Victoria on maps. And around the same time, the British East India Company, which was a huge economic empire to the east of the continent had a transport route that went all the way around the south of the African continent or through the Red Sea. So it avoided the interior continent. So they were really motivated to seek out better trade routes to transport goods into the Mediterranean and into Europe. So the main objective in Kenya, you can see on the right, was to create a trade route with a railway line running directly from Mombasa at the coast of the continent into Lake Nyanza, down the Nile and into the Mediterranean. So the problem with these maps was that they were drawn almost like blank canvases. So this was one of the main resources on the left that we had before the trip to understand the built culture of the Samburu people. And it was a very big scale map at about 1:50,000. And we also had a few written sources from anthropologists like Paul Spencer, who described the culture in words and diagrams, but it lacked a lot of visual representation of their built culture. So on the right, you can see the aerial photographs that they used to make this map. So they flew squadron aircrafts at about 20,000 feet over the land with a multi-lens camera, and then using some triangulation points that they had in the field, and they sent back these photographs to a laboratory for cartographers to draw. So there was very little documentation of interaction that was actually in the field. And these maps were then very distant observations. So it left out a lot of detail about existing occupation by native people. So this is the map on the left, and it measures 1.6 by 2 meters in size. So it's a scale of 1:8,000. And the reason that we chose this large scale was so that it was experiential as you stand in front of the map. So it's made of cloth, and it becomes an object that's more portable than paper. So the woven material is more synonymous with the act of migrating and bundling up objects, and it emanates the traditional cloths and the woven mats that they use in building their house. So when you get closer to the map, it shows rural settlements and also urban settlements of a town called Wamba, and it's all within 15-kilometer radius of each other. So when we drew the map, we included elements that are traditional to Western cartography, so that when you see it at first in the exhibition, it appears like a traditional map with contour lines, the universal coordinate grid. But we've also been critical about some traditional cartographic elements, such as the longitude distance, not only from the meridian in Greenwich, but also from our location in Dublin. And this was sort of a first suggestion for the viewer to start thinking about the map from a new reference point as it relates to them in the exhibition, rather than relating it from the orthodoxy of the Greenwich meridian line. And on the bottom right, you can see the cluster of settlements. So we drew the circular enclosure of the houses, with each one on the map having an organic shape and a multiple number of houses. And then at the center of the enclosure, we indicated with a gold dot what we would signify as the hearth, or like the source of life, which is their animal pen. And then the green patches are there to represent areas of grass, which is also their source of life, as they're pastoralists. So then on the top right, the landscape and the grass is very seasonal dependent. So in the town of Wamba, routes and boundaries appear and disappear depending on the season. So when you get to this urban area of Wamba, the traditional circular settlements are completely replaced by plots in a grid, and only single houses are in each plot. So the individual houses are placed randomly within each plot, as if there's sort of an unprogrammed pattern trapped within the grid. And the circular shape or the hearth that was the animal pen is completely gone as you get closer to this urban development. And then a very Western settlement pattern appears. And you can see houses start to cluster at the main road, which is the brown mark, which is the shops that kind of create a mercantile thoroughfare. So then I'll pass you over to Kriti, and she can explain her dissertation.
Yeah, So I was involved in making the map and also looking at the old 1960 map. And obviously, like Sylvia said, how there was barely any information and there was no regard to how the people occupied the land. And in the 1960 map, you can like see that there's only this one kind of spot of the Wamba town, which was kind of developed when missionaries came to the land. And then the only other kind of main infrastructure is the road, which kind of created this boundary almost. And I was kind of interested in that and colonial mapping in general. So I started looking at that, the same thing for my dissertation, and I'm basing it in Mumbai, and how when the town developed, it was very like a small fishing community. And kind of a similar thing happened where the map that was drawn was kind of taken to face value as a blank canvas, and then borders were drawn, and then a similar kind of settlement, Western settlement started happening. And obviously now, as you know, Mumbai is just a big city, metropolitan city almost. And I think Peter is as well looking at Nairobi for his dissertation, so he will tell you about that.
Yeah, so this was the contour model, which is in the exhibition as well, and it was worked on in conjunction with the map, and it sort of acts as a 3D visualizer for the map, while also highlighting the differences, the important differences between the lowlands where the settlements are located, and the highlands of Matthews Range, which is much more forested and wild. And all this work then essentially inspired my dissertation topic. Kind of the viewing of everything through a Western lens interested me. So I began to consider what other aspects of architecture are affected by this line of thought. So for my dissertation, I'm looking at Nairobi, and specifically the urbanization of it and its urban plan, which I think is sort of an interesting case study, as it's a city built by colonists with European values in mind, and sort of at the top of the priority list. So yeah, that's sort of what I'm looking at for my dissertation.
Yeah, so just a quick introduction, I suppose, to how there's all this information that was done by the students who went over to Kenya, and then obviously the staff and students who took all these photos, and we're starting to make the maps and all this stuff. So just in terms of how we set about putting shape on it and actually curating it for the exhibition, we spent a lot of time going through the content that had been gotten by staff and students, the photos, the maps, etc. And then also we spent a lot of time looking at exhibitions that had studied these sub-Saharan countries before, what they'd done right and what they hadn't done right, and kind of through looking at those two things in parallel, I think we developed an attitude of how we should go about presenting this content. So as you can see here, this is a plan of the exhibition space in the archive, and with 4 elevations of each of the vitrines. So there was 8 of us. We split into pairs and took a vitrine each. So as you can see, climate change, house building, gender, and migration were the 4 topics. And we spent a lot of time drawing layouts, drawing them again, and just kind of through an iterative process, I suppose, we developed how we wanted them to look, how we wanted the discussions we were having to come across. And if you could go into the next slide, please, Sylvia. There's Kate did this model, Kate New did this model, just trying to visualize all the drawings we had done together in the one space and see how it all panned out together. And then I think there's a couple more photos on the next slide also of it, which, yeah, it was really helpful to as like with the pandemic and all, we couldn't go in person, or we didn't have a lot of opportunities to physically mock up what we were going to have. So I think all the drawings we did and the models like this were kind of invaluable in figuring out how it would look. And then just to dive into the vitrines themselves, on the next slide we have the gender vitrine, which myself and Andre worked on. And yeah, our goal for this was to discuss the different roles that men and women play in Samburu society, and kind of I guess there was three things, three subsections of this one that we wanted to look at. The first was women's role in Samburu society. The second was men's role. And then the third was how the women's role kind of relates to the house, or kind of bring it back to house building. So yeah, the final vitrine looks slightly different just because of logistical sizes of pictures and things. But I think it still gets across the same points that we had intended. So just on the next slide, there's three of the photos up a bit closer. Sorry, yeah, here. So when we were looking at kind of the traditional roles that women carry out in society, there's things like taking care of livestock, and there was a strong association with the Nkaji, or the home, that they also created. As you can see in the central photo, there's Marino, who's nailing in these large posts that kind of form the structure of the house. Yes, we had a few photos in it that looked at all the work that the women do to create the houses. So there's hard manual labor like this, and then there's also other photos of kind of fine weaving of the roof structure and such. So it was great skill required in it, and we were just I guess showing a snapshot of the work they do. And then on the right we have the Moran, which are the warriors of the society. And we only had a few photos of this, but their role is often outside the home. So I guess in terms of how we were looking at a house, I feel the women kind of were more closely associated with building it, and then also maintaining the hearths and such in it. So yeah, that was the first vitrine. And then I think there's another one after.
Yeah, so the vitrine Akati and myself looked at focused on the theme of migration, which was interesting due to the sort of inherent juxtaposition in showing movement through still images. So we tried to do this by covering a range of sort of sub-themes under the broader theme of migration. So for example, looking at the relationship between the landscape and water, or some of the less obvious catalysts of movement, such as the acacia bushes surrounding the manyatta, the lifespan of which might prompt the moving of the manyatta itself. And another sub-theme we looked at was the constant presence of reminders of movement. So such as the display of the donkey panniers, which you can see in the top right there, which were on display in the houses themselves.
Sorry, just back, sorry. So I was also looking at this vitrine, and I was kind of looking at how the landscape is changing because of kind of new mobilities being added to the landscape in terms of electricity and mobile network connectivity. So on the bottom left is an image of this new kind of informal infrastructures coming in, kind of like they call the satellite rock, and there's another tree called the phone tree, which is where you would get kind of mobile networks, and that's where people would meet everyone, kind of becoming like focal points of movements for the tribes, and like these connections are not visible because they're kind of assimilated in the landscape, but then you can map these, and then also they're kind of providing migration in like different scales. You can move across the landscape, but then there's movement to kind of town settlements. As you can see, Langasaka is on the picture on the top right, where people are kind of moving towards a more Western settlement away from the traditional, and it's like allowing people to kind of move further out to get education. Like the interpreter of the trip, Saddam, was a Moran warrior, but he left to get education, but now he's back, so he was able to kind of communicate with the people who went on the trip and the local people. So he's kind of bridging the gap almost, and making I don't know, like allowing information to kind of reach a wider audience.
Yeah, so this is the Vitrine for climate change, which was actually curated by Kira Fahy and Kate New, who unfortunately couldn't be here. And it's situated on the center wall in the front of the exhibition, and it discusses the witness effects that climate change has actually had on various aspects of life in Samburu and northern Kenya more widely. And so the Samburu tribe, it continually confronts and adapts to the challenges that have been induced by global warming in the region. And these, things such as desertification, erosion, extreme weather events, and insect plagues are just a few to mention. And from this, some issues have arisen, such as scarcity of house building materials. And these materials would have been traditionally resourced directly from the local landscape. And Samburu women have come to adapt to these changes by often recycling valuable Lemuhi tree branches from the frames of older houses that have been deconstructed. So this idea of readapt, reuse, and intricately woven sisal mats called suti were once routinely used as roofing for lowland houses. However, now cardboard and plastics and textiles are predominantly used, because I suppose they're more predominant in resource. And I think there's such a significant amount that we can actually learn from the wind builders of the Samburu tribe, as there's just so much that they can actually teach us on how we can consider sustainability in more applied ways, and the resourcefulness and inventive approaches, I suppose, to using these recycled materials. It just demonstrates an agile kind of viewpoint, I suppose, that can readily respond to and tackle environmental change.
Then finally onto the house building vitrine that myself and Niall worked on. But really the overview that Samu gave earlier on the significance of the Nkaji was, really beautiful, because it explained how it relates to the family structure, how it's built exclusively by the women and how they impart that knowledge from one generation to the next. And Noah and Andre talked about that as well, but also how the architecture of the Nkaji relates to their nomadic lifestyle. So, it's all designed and built for disassembly and reassembly. And then also how it relates to the landscape, which also connects to the migration and climate change vitrines, because it's all related naturally. So yeah, as Andre was saying, how all the materials are locally resourced, apart from obviously recent developments where some materials are becoming increasingly scarce and they've had to switch over to using plastic tarps, particularly in the roof structure. But I think it would be nice just to very, very quickly go through the actual construction process. So if we go to the next slide, the one before that one, I think. Yeah, here we go. So very briefly, in the top left photo, you can see the panja being used to chop the branches which are going to be used as uprights. Those branches, they're usually around 1.2 to 1.6 meters. And then in the following slide, you see them being pushed down into the trench, which is also dug by the panja, about 3 inches deep. And then they're compacted with sand to keep them upright, to brace them horizontally. Slightly different timber, which is more flexible, is then tied to the uprights with ribbons of bark. They're usually about 3 lines of horizontal bracing. And then once that's completed, in the 4th photo in the bottom left corner, you can see it's an absolutely stunning photograph. Some sheets of bark, again from a different plant that was used for the ribbons of bark that are used for the tying, that's then woven in between the vertical uprights and the horizontal bracing to create a screen to then pat on a mud mix, which is mixed in the middle of the Nakaji. There's a fantastic clip of it in the film, which hopefully people will see when you go to see the exhibition. But this mud mix is a combination of mud, soil, ash, and then a cow and camel dung. So it's the cow and camel dung, the fibrous particles, and that is, as they dry, they encourage the binding that make it so strong. And then the ash also acts as a natural termite deterrent. And then finally, once they finished all of the walls, in the second last photo, you can see really gorgeous close-up of the roof lattice structure. It kind of functions as an inverted bark. It's constructed using the same flexible, very thin branches that were used for the horizontal bracing. And then that's tied down onto the top of the walls. And then, as Andre was explaining, there was a photograph earlier, I think on one of Samu's slides, of the traditional straw dupai mats, which used to be used for the entire roof, but the straw is becoming increasingly scarce. So as Andre was saying, they're having to resort to plastics and tarps, which, as Samu mentioned, that's causing some problems for the ventilation with the internal fire that they have. And then the final stunning image shows how strong the building is, and you can see there's one of the kids standing on top. But then also, so that study of the construction processes kind of laid the foundations for my dissertation topic as well, which will involve a study of the feasibility of using native grown materials for both structural and insulation components. So as with the Nakaji, but applying it commercially in Ireland. So as we mentioned at the beginning, it's a general consensus and a goal that we all want to try and build more sustainably. So if I can manage to establish that combination of like straw and wool and native timbers are feasible in Ireland as structural insulated panels, then I want to examine how an eco product such as this, because there are lots that they're already out there, but how they can break into the Irish market, or how they're struggling to break in. So really it's going to be finding out what the existing mitigating factors that we have in Ireland, and then hopefully figure out how we can evolve our construction and specification practices to encourage transitioning, to using more of these types of products. And also, I think Niall was going to explain how this connects into his dissertation as well.
Thanks, Leanne. So my dissertation kind of is extracted more from the general theme of the exhibition, or one of the general themes, which is the Eurocentricity of architecture, rather than specifically house building. And so the title of my dissertation, the working title, I should say, is Decolonizing Architectural Pedagogies 1950 to 2020. And it's basically historiography which looks at the dissemination of architecture in a post-colonial world up to and including the present day. And I suppose as a starting off point, the first question would be, why do architectural pedagogies need to be decolonized? And I suppose the way architecture is taught in most schools is as follows. You start with ancient Egyptian, Greek and Roman architecture, cue the Renaissance, cue early American modernism, the international style, postmodernism, etc. But we rarely discuss why it came to be that the near totality of what we're taught comes from a geographical area, Europe and North America, which represents about 15% of the world's population. And so in my introduction, I discussed the period leading up to the liberation of the colonies to get a sense of the prevailing and inherited schools of thought. So in the 19th century, there was a kind of an obsession with classification, and racialized taxonomies emerged, which were seen as a means of imperial justification. So these were writings and drawings and pseudoscience that were used to assert that the others, that is the non-Europeans, were inherently and genetically inferior. And so some of the loudest proponents of these ideas were architects, actually, such as Eugene Viollet-le-Duc and Owen Jones. And, you know, it's easy now to look back at the 19th century and say, because their ideas were so overt and unfounded, that they're very easy to repudiate, even if, unfortunately, some of their legacy endures. And so as we move to the 20th century, subtly and crucially, the expression of this mutates to something that is not less insidious, but maybe slightly subtler, in that it becomes less about saying that the others are genetically inherently inferior and more about saying that they're just lagging behind in their progression. And so in 1905, Bannister Fletcher publishes this tree of architecture, in which he arranges the architecture along a temporalized evolutionary scale, which culminates in Spanish, German, Dutch, Belgian, and English architecture, and French architecture, which you can see a pattern emerging. It's all European. And so then we get towards the kind of birth of modernism, and, you know, Adolf Loos writes his seminal work, Ornament and Crime, in 1913, which is considered to some extent a founding doctrine of modernism, and not modernist architecture rather. And some people associate this modernism with a kind of a breaking away from imperialism and its associations. And yet modernism has strong racial underpinnings at its core. And, you know, a quote from this essay, Loos says, quote, "The human embryo in the womb passes through all the evolutionary stages of the animal kingdom. When man is born, his sensory impressions are like those of a newborn puppy. His childhood takes him through all the metamorphoses of human history. At 2, he sees with the eyes of a Papuan. At 4, with those of an ancient Teuton. At 6, with those of Socrates. At 8, with those of Voltaire," close quote. And this speaks to the enduring idea that modernism is the apotheosis of the European technological, cultural, and artistic progression. Charles Davis of Princeton University has done some amazing research on this phenomenon in the American context, in which he picks apart some of the foundations of Frank Lloyd Wright's work, using the Martin House as a case study and the troubling creation of the prairie ideal. And he refers to American architecture as the settler colonial project. And so I start with the core of my essay around the 1953 conference in London on tropical architecture, held in University College London. And I think tropical architecture is symbolically important, as it represents a link between the old and the new world. And officially it was seen as a way of practicing architecture in a post-colonial world. And the AA created a course in tropical architecture in, I think, 1955, which represents the first architecture course taught through a post-colonial lens. And tropical architecture was basically conceived as a means of responding to conditions in tropical countries, aka the global south. In this sense, while it was well-intentioned, it often and unsurprisingly became a proxy for an extension of European hegemony. And modern masters of tropical architecture, such as Le Corbusier, Oscar Niemeyer, and Lino Bobardi, have been criticized in this regard. And so, you know, briefly, I look at the creation of post-colonial architecture programs in places like Ankara, Singapore, Kabul, Nairobi, and their genesis, their mold, their financing, their mission. I look at the role of global institutions like the UN, to a lesser extent the Ford Foundation, and how the UN created, you know, the Habitat 1, 2, and 3, and the idea of human settlements, and ways of thinking and working in so-called third world countries. And I look at Western universities and their immediate response to the problem of a Eurocentric pedagogy. MIT Harvard Joint Initiative, the Development Planning Unit in UCL. And I look at the resurgence of race to the forefront of public discourse and the most recent developments, such as the creation of the Graduate School of Architecture in Johannesburg in 2016, and the Radical Pedagogies initiative by PhD students in the Princeton School of Architecture, whose work featured in the 2014 Venice Biennale. And so in summary, the paper that I'm working on aims to first identify the position of architecture at the formal end of colonialism, and secondly, to chart the progress of architectural teaching away from colonialism and its legacy today. And the question is, how have we progressed? So that's it. Thanks.
So yeah, I'd like to just add to that as well. I'm conscious of time because I know we'd like to discuss some things at the end, but I just want to say that, like, personally, I found a lot of value in contributing to the exhibition as it spiked my own interest in further researching the history of curatorial practice, and specifically focusing on the colonialist approach to exhibiting objects as, you know, exotic or other, or even worse, exploiting the exploitation of people. So my own dissertation is actually looking at the reassessment of the tradition of exhibiting architecture from local communities. And going back to what Noah mentioned earlier, when we began to curate this exhibition, we spent a lot of time researching exhibitions and readings, which highlighted ethical issues in the realm of architectural curatorial practice. And it was incredibly vital that we did this, so that because we all have a duty when we're exhibiting things such as this, to be sensitive to subject matter which we discuss. And from this, I believe that it's quite difficult not to become reproachful and speculative of, you know, past precedents, but of course in such a way that is educational and informative of better practice. And one exhibition that does come to mind, or not exhibition, an exhibition that comes to mind from the past would be like the 1937 Paris Colonial Exposition, where many issues have now been discussed in hindsight. And Patricia A. Morton highlights in her book, Hybrid Modernities, the architectural representation during its time of running. And the exposition is quite problematic in hindsight when we consider the way in which curators displayed people and material culture and raw materials, etc., of the global colonial empires. However, there was a very clear separation created between the colonizer and the colonized, occurring through demonstration of Europe's self-proclaimed kind of sophisticated influence, in contrast with the colonial pavilions, which were deemed as authentic native environments for displaying native indigenous people and artifacts from colonies. And you know, this research kind of prompted questions which need to be consistently made to ensure better ethical approach to curatorial practice. You know, when we consider the museum and objects of ethnography which have been put on display, we must consider, you know, the origin of these objects and the purpose for it being displayed. There's also quite this detachment between objects' definitive purpose of art or artifact. And there's also the consideration of, I suppose, who benefits financially from the presentation of these objects, and was it the previous owner or the museum? But yeah, I'll leave that there because I know we do need to discuss. So I'll hand it back to you there, Hugh.
Thank you, Andre. Thanks, everybody. That was really very rich and fascinating work, which I suppose, like from a very specific field trip, it opens up all these very, I suppose, major vistas on the practice and the history of architecture, of settlement, and I suppose global politics more broadly. So there's a lot there. And I mean, I'm conscious that in the chat already we have had there've been questions maybe asked and answered, you might say. There was a question from Sarah. Sarah, do you want to just maybe talk a little bit about your question was about Mumbai in comparison to Nairobi? Maybe it was going specifically to Peter.
Yeah, I'm kind of studying like the colonization period in Khartoum in Sudan. I was just kind of interested if there was like the same kind of patterns in Nairobi and Mumbai and in Khartoum, because I was reading that like basically what the British kind of did in Khartoum was that they split up the urban fabric between the British and then the Egyptians, and then they had like the native Sudanese people, which was, they're broken up into like first class residents, second class and third class. And then like the plot sizes and the, basically like what the land was used for is kind of different in all of these spaces. And they had like nicer spaces in the first class residents, and yeah, I'm just kind of interested if they kind of did something similar in these places as well.
And I don't know, Akriti, maybe do you want to come back on that, or Peter?
I mean, in terms of Nairobi, there's definitely like crossovers. Like the whole idea of the segmented plan is like really apparent in Nairobi, but it's less obviously stated. The idea of sort of the different classes in the areas definitely exists, but it's not labeled as such. It's sort of apparent when you study it, I suppose. And yeah, it's the sort of idea of like controlling through these segments. Again, is less obviously stated, but it's just sort of apparent, and there's a presence there. The sort of idea of spaces of observation, so you kind of feel like you're maybe always being watched, or you know, the idea of creating this segmented plan, which was actually because it was, you know, sort of easier to police and control and administer. So yeah, there's definitely crossovers between what you're saying there and
I think it's really
I was
different.
talking to Samantha earlier, and I think that like there's a shift as well in how the Imperial Empire like planned their cities. So Mumbai was planned like almost a century kind of before Nairobi. So I think like still in Mumbai there was points where like there are like black towns and white towns, where like the kind of yeah, these second and third class citizens would be, and then there's these spaces which were reserved for where the colonial officers and those people and their families would live. So there was definitely like an area kind of prescribed, and it still exists, obviously not that like it's just even still like the spaces are defined by the kind of people who live there. Yeah.
Could I maybe just ask a question? Because of course I mean, one of the, in a way, the focal point of the exhibition is the field trip that you guys made, or a number of you made, sorry, a couple of years ago now. So what part does the experience of the field trip itself play, if you like, in the opening up of the various questions and the sort of larger themes, you know, that come from it? In other words, I'm just wondering how vital an element the field trip itself is, and the way in which it's conducted is in, you know, alerting and being alert, let's say, to the role of women, to the impact of climate change, and also then a linked question would be whether the field trip reveals all of those facets of this place and this culture, or whether that there's then another layer of activity after the fact that brings those aspects more clearly into view. Sorry, that's a very long-winded question. It's just I don't know whether maybe somebody who was there might want to respond.
Yeah, well, I just think that sort of before we went, the research that we were able to do seemed like it sort of did have a bias view on it. So we had like maps that didn't really show much detail. And then we only had really one anthropologist, Paul Spencer, who was describing the Samburu people in very much detail. So there wasn't anything that was really visual about how they built their houses or their settlements or anything like that. So I think to sort of get an unbiased view, the trip was really important in that way, so we could get a first-hand experience of it, instead of trying to rely on something that has previously, like historically, been sort of through a Western viewpoint.
And then just in terms of how that exchange, because I mean, it's not just you being there observing, you're obviously participating in making of the houses, right? Or like, so it's not a passive observation of a culture. It's an engagement with. Is that, I mean, I'm just trying to figure it out. That was how it was set up, right?
Yeah. So yeah, it was us building the house with them. So I suppose there was a real exchange between both of us, that they were learning about us and we were learning about them, and it was sort of a more open dialogue, as if we weren't just reading it from books.
And just to, I mean, it's clear now already this project is, I mean, taking off in lots of different directions. Could I don't know, Samantha, if you wanted to say something about the future direction, or where you think it's going next?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. But Samu, did you want to come in and say something?
Yes, I just wanted to mention how before we went there, we did a lot of research on Belinda Strait, who wrote a lot about the spiritual connection built in Samburu, and going the connection between how the houses are made and the spiritual meaning behind the objects of the houses. So bringing that back to the exhibition, we wanted to, by being there, we're understanding the deeper meaning behind how they actually build, and a lot of it has a spiritual meaning. So I think that's also one reason why it was important to be on site and actually connect with the process of making the NKG, to understand that spiritual connection that we read about a lot previously before we went over. To mention that.
Yeah. So to continue on from that, well, first of all, thanks to all the students who did a great job today. So it's really wonderful to see all of it coming together. And one of the biggest things that we got out of this whole experience was learning how to be better listeners. And I think certainly the research that we accumulated before, we realized how in some cases, like with examples with the maps that we poured over, they became irrelevant when we arrived on site. And it was great that we had collected them, because it acknowledged how little we understood and knew. And because we had sort of inversed the usual methodology of fieldwork, where we go in and sort of look at things objectively and extract information as atomized scholars, we put ourselves instead in a position of being taught. And that was hugely valuable, because it opened up avenues for other types of discussions that have evolved from the project. So when we came back, one of the first things we started to do is look at ways to return. And of course, now with the pandemic, it's made this very difficult. But two of my colleagues who joined us on the trip, I should say, it was very interdisciplinary. So we had archaeologists, a civil engineer, we had an ecologist as well. And we have someone who is in the School of Archaeology, but Claire Cave, who works on World Heritage Conservation. And so Claire and her colleague, Brendan O'Neill, who's an archaeologist, they've been successful in gaining funding from UCD to essentially create a second pilot of this project, but on UCD's campus. So we're still very excited about this. It was supposed to happen in September, but hopefully it will happen in 2021. And we've managed through the financial support of UCD, but also through our wonderful contacts through the Kenyan embassy and our contacts on the ground in the Samburu County. We're going to bring some of our colleagues to Dublin, and we're going to build a Samburu style Lowlands House in the experimental outdoor laboratory up on the other side of campus. So
Right.
That will be a really wonderful experience, because part of looking at the internationalization and global architecture, we really do have a responsibility, myself and our colleagues, to look at how internationalization can affect, can be implemented in a way that everyone has a role to play, can participate. It's not just for those who are internationally mobile, but how we can build internationalization into the existing curriculum. So that's the plan for the next year. And we also have a colleague in Nairobi who will be coming to visit she's been appointed a visiting professor at UCD, Dr. Nakatha Gachuya at the University of Nairobi, who's really been in sort of one of our guiding lights from the project from the very beginning, I have to say. And she's in the School of Architecture at the University of Nairobi and works a lot on informal urbanism, but is very active in questioning the definition of development and how development needs to be recalibrated in these large cities. So she'll eventually be visiting us in person, but I think we're going to organize some kind of Zoom event with her in the meantime as well.
That's great, fantastic. So next academic year, there'll be, with the Experimental Archaeology Center, there'll be that will be something that students will participate in as well? Or?
Yeah, it was supposed to take place. They were supposed to be here the same week as the exhibition, and so they would be here for both, and they were going to talk at the opening and thing and so on and so forth. But so it would be yes. It's really important to stress that it's not only going to be it's not just a duplication, but it's going to be reaching out to other more than just students in architecture and engineering. We had a civil engineering student with us last year, which was great. And certainly the feedback from the trip was, can we make it more cross-disciplinary? Can we have students in ecology, for example? Can we have students in sociology? So that would be, very easy to facilitate on the ground here in UCD.